Good morning, everyone. I am here with Jim Leonard from the East Pennsboro Historical Society, and he has been willing to give us a virtual tour of the Historical Society today. If you see anything that you're interested in, please send me an email, and I'll include that email address at the end, and we can look at things a little more in depth in the future. Jim, I'll turn the floor over to you now.
All right, thanks. Welcome and thanks for coming into our Historical Society. We were established back in 1999 before we got this building from the township by Herb Kruger, who was our original executive director. And during his tenure from 1999 up through 2003, he worked out of his house establishing a lot of stuff that he was putting on his own home computer. And once he got control of having a museum building and a place to work and store all of our archives, why, he was just a workhorse developing the programs that we deal with here in the community, and just building a fantastic museum here and giving the township accessibility to the history of what we're all about here in Enola. And basically it all starts out with the railroad. And the railroad was actually opened up in 1905 after the completion of the Rockville Bridge. And at that time this was all farmland. And to make a long story short, the farmland was bought up by the Pennsylvania Railroad back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they had to excavate the whole east side of the township here towards the river and lay out all the tracks and just build a huge operation for a railroad center. And it was going to be a classification yard where they could bring long-haul trains into Enola and break them down and make them into brand new trains that were going to go east and south and north and west to get all the freight that's needed in the East Coast here, all over the East Coast. And this was the hub. This was considered the largest classification yard in the world from 1945 up through the early 50s. So it was a very massive undertaking. And along with that, the Pennsylvania Railroad hired the Manor Realty Company to lay out the town.
Did you say the Manor Realty Company?
Yeah, M-A-N-O-R.
Okay.
And they were hired to actually even buy up the farmland from the farmers so that the Pennsylvania Railroad could get control of all of this property. And then, of course, lay it out like they did. And in 1905, the yard was open, and all of a sudden this just became a massive railroad boom town. West Fairview was already established. It was, already almost 150 years old, and therefore most of the people that came here to go to work were rooming in rooming houses that were down in West Fairview. They had to build a huge sort of like a hotel for the men to live in while they were working here in the yard, building the yard, and then eventually a lot of them went right to the railroad to go to work and stayed here. They came from all over the world, mostly Italy and other parts of Europe, plus all of the folks around here that were out of work because of the nail mill that collapsed over the years. The nail mill was just down over the hill from us, on this side of the creek, across from West Creek Hills. And the nail mill, that was built back in the early 1800s and finally died out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And with that, most of the people that were working in West Fairview and Harrisburg in that location needed work. So they just jumped right into the rail yard and got hired so that they could continue to make a living. So along with all that, you know, there's just a tremendous amount of history here in Enola. Take the name of the town itself. It's named Enola right after the Enola Yard. And up here, I'm going to point up to Enola Miller. The town was named after her. And her home was down in Somerdale. I'll pull this photo out. And this was her home in Somerdale.
And it's beautiful. I've seen that home.
That home's down there yet at First and Valley Road. And I hate to tell you about the plans of it having to be moved someday, but it's the only way we can save the house because that property is all going to be developed someday. So that's another long story that we're trying to preserve history in. So how the Enola actually became named was her father, Wesley Miller, who is in this photograph. I'll pull this out.
Thank you very much for pulling those out.
Enola and Frances. She inherited the house from her parents. And her and Wesley got married young and lived in that house and had little baby Enola, along with some other children that were in the family. And as she was about maybe 4 years old or so, the rail yard, I shouldn't say the rail yard, the Pennsylvania Railroad, buying up property, bought a lot of property from Wesley, who had farmland all the way to the river from Somerdale east. And they bought that property and gave Wesley an opportunity to name the flag station. I'm going to lay this here. There was a flag station established.
What is a flag station, Jim?
That was a small building, and it was used to control an extra track that they put in a single track where there was a single track railroad. And that siding track is where they would store a train so that another train could pass on that single track. If you can understand this. Originally there was just one track going north and south through that farmland before it was actually developed into the yard. And in 1888, the Northern Central Railroad established this extra little siding so that, because they were getting so much freight going north and south, that they needed a place so that they could put trains so other trains could pass by as they were going up and down north and south. So originally they could only have one train going down that track or going north up that track for a long way between Baltimore and sort of like Marysville. There were really not any sidings in the middle so that they could have more than one train moving on that single
pass
track.
by each other.
So they established a siding, a little freight station where a guy can control a switch to make that train go in there without any problems in order to have that other train go by. So what they did, I'm going to walk over here to the other side of the room and have you focus on this window here. There's they had this special notice, and it's a little difficult to see, but that special notice is the original special notice that was put out by the Northern Central Railroad establishing that siding or that little freight station. So that being what it was, Wesley Miller had the opportunity to name that little flag station. And there were several names, offered up to the railroad for them to decide what they wanted to use. And it all came down to Enola. His daughter's name was submitted, and they accepted that. So it was a little tiny flag station. It became a very large yard, and it became Enola the town as the big cycle went around during that period of time.
All right.
So
not many ladies can say they have a town named after them.
not too many, but there's probably quite a few in the in the whole country, actually. Yeah, you figure like Marietta, maybe. That might have been named after a woman. There's quite a few, actually. So, since we're on this side of the museum, I'm going to offer up some more information about myself personally. When I got out of the Army in 1965, I needed a job, and this was in May. And I actually went over to the Pennsylvania station in Harrisburg and submitted an application for the railroad. And I got hired on the railroad in July of 1965. And I worked 38 years in the yard as a clerk. And during that period of time, I really learned a lot about the yard. I didn't work in train service, but I understood how it all operated because I called crews to work. I worked in the diesel shop for quite a while, learning how they store parts for engines where they worked, where they maintained them in the Enola diesel shop. I worked in the power desk area where they actually got orders from Harrisburg Yard to make up power for trains going in and out of the yard. So I was a clerk that made the records and made the phone calls as an in-between guy from the Movement Bureau. Hey, we need a set of engines for a set of power that's going out at a certain time. And I would call on the phone to some men out in the yard and tell them, hey, we need 2 engines for a train. And they would put them together and get them ready to go out and hook up to a train and go wherever it's designated to go.
So you were the hub of the business, huh?
I was an in-between guy at that point, yes. And I also worked in Harrisburg Yard for 5 years, my last 5 years on the railroad. And over there I was an inspector of tractor trailers going in and out of the yard, where they load the, the tractor trailer units for double stacking on trains hauling freight again. So I was inspecting tractor trailers going in and out of North Harrisburg Yard. But we're going to talk about Enola Yard here. So just to give you an idea of what I did originally, this is a picture of me with a couple clerks that I worked with. I'm the guy in the beard. I worked in Enola Yard calling crews to work for, approximately 15 years. And I worked in a building called the Brick Office. And I guess I moved that. But anyway, this is a picture of the Brick Office that used to be in Enola Yard. That was brought into operation in 1905 when the yard opened. And men slept in that building in the upstairs part while they were waiting to be called for work. And the lower area of that building is where they made the tickets for the trains, called the men for work. They had a terminal superintendent's office that was in charge of the whole yard to make sure that the operation worked the way it was supposed to. And for 15 years of my life, I worked in there. And then in the 1980s, it became dilapidated and worn out. Had a lot of asbestos in there that they needed to get rid of. So they tore the building down, and along went progress. They didn't call crews anymore here. And things just changed in general because of the way everything evolved communication-wise and so forth through the years. But in our museum here, we have a lot of artifacts that people have donated to us. We have a lot of photographs, just a ton of odds and ends. Some are large and some are small. Some are too large for us to have in here, and we have in a storage area next to our building here.
I'd like to get a picture of this if that's
This
okay.
here is a diagram of the inner works of the Enola Yard. The way it worked, I'm going to give you some idea of how it worked here. This yard was laid out as a very large hump area here, and then the excavation of it made it go downhill there and downhill here towards West Fairview. In the middle they had a very large roundhouse where they maintained steam engines. These tracks over here were tracks where trains would come in the yard and be stored because there were so many of them coming in the yard. They would go over this hump and be divided up into new trains in this classification yard. These trains would go west and north. Coming in from the north and west, they would come down these receiving yard tracks to this hump area and be divided up into new trains in this section of classification tracks. They would go south and east out of Enola Yard to many different areas, you know, like Philly, Baltimore, and so forth, south and east. So that's the way the Enola Yard was designed. These are what are called the retarders, and the way they worked was as cars were coming down over this hump, they had a guy in the middle there separating these cars, as break them up to have individual cars go down over this hump and be divided up. But in order to do that, they had to be going down over this hump with brakes on them, and that's what these were. They were squeezers and they were air brakes, and there would be a guy on a retarder that would control them with control knobs and so forth, so that they could slow them down, that they wouldn't get demolished as they were banging into the back end of new trains that were being made. So that's just a short story of a very large operation. In our museum here, we have several items of interest. This photograph here was in the Des Moines Bank, probably for like maybe 30 or 40 years. So when they closed that bank up, we were given an opportunity to have that as part of our museum here. And you can see that the steam engines on the left of the old days and the electric engines of the modern day with the GG1, which was one of the most popular engines that was ever built to run on the railroad. Of course, they had to run in areas that were electrified with electric wiring because they had to have, you know, thousands of volts of electricity going down through these rods into the engine to make those engines work. Of course, these were steam engines, and they had to run by coal power, coal, steam engine, and water.
So they had a whole lot going on at the same time.
Well, this was the evolution of rail history, you know. As long as most people could ever remember the early days of railroading, you know, it was steam power. And as it evolved, it became diesel and electric power. Eventually, electric power was too costly, and in order for them to haul longer, heavier trains, they just needed too many engines running electric, and the electric wasn't big enough to actually make those engines haul those big heavy trains. So they created very, very efficient diesel engines, and that's the evolution of power today, the way they run trains with diesel engines. Just looking over here a little bit, it might be difficult for you to see. These are different items of stock that they sold to executives and so forth to finance the operation of rail power or rail transportation throughout the whole world. Most large corporations had stock to offer either their employees or public.
So this is the beginnings of them selling stock?
Yeah, they sold stock to get an operation, to have money to make the company operate. Going around the room, we're just going to look at some other items of interest that we have other than railroad some people have offered us some antiques. They're not really of anything significant about Enola itself, but it's history, and some items we accept to just show this is another part of the evolution of different kinds of communication throughout the world, you know. So this radio, it just isn't anything significant. It's just an old radio, but we have it in our museum. It's a point of interest we can talk about. That's something that people would actually use to listen to events in history over the years. And one of the biggest things, of course, was listening to what was going on during World War II. And that was, they would sit around in the evenings in their homes after people got home from work, and families would gather, listen to the news, listen to different kind of shows that were being communicated to the world, like The Shadow and other things that evolved and turned into from radio series to TV series, of course, as the entertainment industry, you know, evolved too.
And Jim, can you tell me what this is here?
I can. This is out of a passenger train, out of the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the Pennsylvania Railroad passenger cars. We never really had passenger power established going in and out of Enola, but somebody actually had this stuff that is, as the evolution of passenger trains moved from one part of the century to another, these items were cast aside. They didn't use them from one part of the early 1900s up through the late 1900s, and somebody bought this or got this that was thrown out or something. And this is just something that they had in a passenger car next to some seats that were in this passenger, probably the dining car, and they had their drink holders and their, of course, their little
Coasters.
Yeah. So this is just an item that was out of a passenger train car.
Thank you. That was something that piqued my interest when I was here the first time.
Yeah, and they had some pretty cushy chairs for passengers back in those early days. I have a lot of items that were involved with Conrail. Conrail was established to save the railroad from going bankrupt. Now, Pennsylvania Railroad, of course, was the railroad from 1905 up through the early 1960s, whenever they went bankrupt and consolidated with the New York Central. The New York Central was going on up through the 1960s to 1976. During that period, the Penn Central Railroad, which was the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, consolidated, and they went belly up too. They just didn't make it. So what happened is, you know, our country was in dire straits at that time, and they needed to save the railroad. And in order to do so, the United States government took over the railroad industry. And what they did was they separated passenger service and freight service in order to get things more separated and more under control. So they established Amtrak, and that was all passenger service. And they established Conrail from 1976 all the way up through 1998, whenever it was sold off to the Norfolk Southern Railroad. So these are items that were given out to the employees. You know, they're knickknacks, memorabilia, whatever you want to call it. But whenever Conrail would have safety meetings at different locations for the employees, and I'm talking about all over the Consolidated Railroad locations that were established at the time, and Enola Yard was one, and Harrisburg Freight Yard was another. And at these locations, they would have safety meetings. And in order to get the attention of the employees, they would give out these gifts to the employees. And these are a bunch of the odds and ends that I accumulated over that period of time while I was working. They gave us watches. That's okay. No problem.
Sorry about
You
that.
step right in there. They gave all kinds of items out. You can see there's just a ton of odds and end memorabilia that I collected, including a really nice watch, a nice Swiss army knife that you would, I guess it was an army knife type thing. And then that was a hard hat I actually used when I worked over here. When I worked in the diesel shop, we had to wear a hard hat for safety reasons, but that was one of the things that I had an opportunity to take home with me whenever Norfolk Southern took over. So they gave us hats, they gave us leather jackets, they gave us nylon jackets, all kinds of clothing, shirts and things like that that I have at home too, hanging up. But I decided that I don't need this stuff anymore, so I just donated it to the Historical Society of East Pennsboro, and they can just be another token of history about the Enola Yard and the railroad in general. We have some other things here that are in our museum that are more local interest type items. I'll pull this out of the way here. This is out of a church. It was, of course, a pew and some stained glass items that were in the EUB church. And also another church that was at the corner, right across from the Ifa Eve. In Enola, there's a big lot there where a church stood at one time that had burned because of being left alone too long and vagrants gone in and
I don't remember if I read that on your website, but when I was doing some research for East Pennsboro history, I did pick up on a story about some of that.
Yeah, this is just some odds and ends that the township pulled out, that they saved and offered them up to us to keep for local history. And I'm really glad they did, because, you know, these churches are gone, but we do have a little token of interest from the particular churches that don't exist in Enola anymore.
Absolutely.
Most of those churches all died out and became consolidated into larger congregational churches like the EUB, which was the United Brethren Church, and the Methodist Church. They were two separate entities at one time. So in order for them to save a church, they consolidated them and built a new bigger church to contain both congregations in order to save them to continue to practice their religion. So we have what's called the United Methodist Church. That was one of those consolidations in Enola. That church is out on the Salt Road at this time, and that became established from the two Enola churches that don't exist anymore. A lot of those properties became apartments and several other types of establishments. In the early days of freight operation and even passenger, they had to communicate with each other on trains. And in order to do so, they would use signal lanterns. Now, a train would have several crew members. They would have an engine man, they would have a fireman, a conductor, and several trainmen. And they couldn't put them all in one particular unit to haul a freight train, so they had a caboose. And in the caboose, the crews would stay on their train until they got to a place where they were going to break down these trains and put these cars in sidings. Like let's say a train had a whole bunch of cars to go to Home Depot because they were going to go drop off some lumber. So they would go to the siding, pull these cars out that had all this freight that Home Depot needed to sell their products, and then put the train back together again, and then move on to the next industry and do the same thing over and over and over. What they do is they would drop off the loads and pick up the empties, drop off the loads and pick up the empties. So in order for them to do that properly and to keep communication with the engine man, they needed to have signal lanterns. And the the conductor and the trainman, they would work in different sections of the train as it's sitting at a siding. In order to set off these cars, they would give signals with a lamp. You know, they would do so many types of either up here, down here, back and forth this way. Those different things meant different orders for a trainman down there in the middle of the train to do his job.
Sort of like our batters and our runners in baseball.
Yeah, they had to
Different
cut them out.
signals.
Cut them
Yep.
out. They would give the signal, you know, move, steal first base, you know.
Right.
Or not first base, but second base from first base and so forth. So yeah, it was the signal system, and that's what they used to communicate with each other. I'm sure you can see that building there, and that was the original hotel building that was opened between 1903 and 1905 in order for these men that were working in the yard to take rest while they were building the yard, and after they had the yard built, in order for crews to take rest between going to work and, you know, in their next trick after they worked all day. They would go there and take rest, get up the next day and go to work, come back to the hotel. And that all happened up until the time they actually had the town built for these railroaders to buy up properties, build houses, and live in them. And it was like a cycle, you know. Come up here, go to work from another location and who knows where, they work in the yard, take rest, eventually build a house, move out, next guy coming into town looking for a place, go to the hotel. Just like maybe a guy now in modern days, you know, he'd have a job where he'd have to go drive to Pittsburgh to a hotel meeting. And
Right.
that's the kind of, you know.
I remember during some of our bad storms we were traveling, and there was a whole hotel that was just PP&L workers that had to travel to different areas.
While we're looking here, I just thought I'd let you know that we have a calendar that we put out every year. We have one at the printer now, and every year we put out a new one with a lot of local interest that we have here in our historical society. It's a nice collection of photographs. We also have a new pictorial history of Enola Yard, and of course it has tons and tons of information and photographs about the history of Enola Yard.
Now, if people would want to purchase these, can they contact the Historical Society to do that, Jim?
Yeah, they can give us a call, come down here and pick that up, or one of the places locally that you can go to is Bruner's Service Station up on Enola Road. Al Bruner sells the same products that we have here. We have a lot of different shirts and stuff that we sell. We also have a lot of different publications that are on the back wall back there. You can take a look back there if you want.
Take a breeze through here quick so people can see what we have to
Yeah, we have
offer.
tons of items here that are of local interest. A walking tour of Enola, trainmen of Enola Yard, pictorial postcards. We have so many postcards from our township that we've made 2 different collections that we sell in our book. We just do this to keep the operation of the Historical Society moving from day to day. One of our items to make some money. So shirts, hats, so forth. We just have a lot of stuff here that may be of local interest. A lot of coat buttons and different things that guys used to wear on their jackets. Some of it's a little hard to explain, hard to understand, but these are all different items that were used in the operation of the early days in the rail yard here.
Now, out of curiosity, sort of like when you're in the military, do the buttons and pins, some of them come because you've earned certain...
No, there's no earning thing involved.
Okay.
But when they get promoted from a brakeman to a conductor, they may get a conductor identification
Okay.
so that people
So
would
it's not
know.
like getting your stripes, but it does let people know that you're now the conductor.
Yeah, right. That would be the exact meaning of that.
Okay.
We give scholarships out from our historical society. we started out giving $500 to our students at East Pennsboro, or a student who would have a parent or a relative of the Historical Society. And it went from 500 to 1,000, and now we're giving out 2 $1,000 scholarships. So they're available for members, relatives who are still in school, looking to get a little money to get them going their first year in college, help buy books, room, who knows. But you know, $1,000 is $1,000 for somebody
absolutely.
to get going their first semester.
$1,000 could probably buy you 2 books nowadays. In my
Maybe so.
time, it probably could have bought you a lot more.
Right, but it gets you going. It's a stepping stone.
And they
$1,000
would,
bucks.
and would they find that information on the website?
It's on
correct?
the website,
Okay.
and we have a new application out now that has to be turned in by the end of March next year for the following year's scholarship earners. Most of them have been from East Pennsboro. Just last year we had a brother and a sister actually get that scholarship, $1,000 each.
Nice.
They go to different colleges, and they got the stepping stone to move on. And all they had to do was fill out an application and take a chance. We have a committee that decides. If we have a lot of people, applying, we work that out and try to get that $1,000 to the person who is more deserving. But they have to be a relative of a member if they aren't a member themselves, and they can become a member. Students can be a member. Don't have to be an adult. $10 a year to be a member of the Historical Society. 20 for a family, 50 for supporting. It's not that much, and that's another way we make money.
Right.
We have 4,500 photographs in our archives. Actually, almost 1,000 of them are rail related. We talked a little bit ago about the roundhouse. Here is an actual picture of the roundhouse during its heyday, and that's where steam engines would be taken to have their maintenance done. And in the middle of that thing, it's all open. You can see here, there's a turntable. And in order for them to get the engine in the right slot where it's going to have a specific kind of a maintenance done, they would put an engine on the turntable, turn it in a certain direction and get it lined up with the tracks, and then run it in there to have its maintenance done. That's the simple, what do you call it, answer to the what they use the roundhouse for. Now here you can see this particular picture of the roundhouse as they're tearing it down, and you can see all the different areas that were used to do maintenance.
A lot of components go into that.
Yeah, it's huge, and this turntable is still used to this day. They've of course torn that all down, and as they were tearing it down, they were also getting ready for diesel power maintenance in the diesel shop, the new modern diesel shop. Right next to it is where they worked on electrified engines. Now, they didn't have to have a big area for that because there weren't very many electric engines that actually come in for maintenance. Most of that maintenance work was done working on batteries, making sure they were charged, because they had a huge battery in them, and of course they had to have the maintenance done on their different electrified sections of the power of the unit. This here is a photograph of the inside of what the brick office looked like at one time, and this is in the early 1900s of some clerks in the brick office. And believe it or not, when I heard in 1965, most of the office still looked like that. They were starting to modernize them, but they still looked very antique-ish.
Right.
This is our work area. I'll just walk back here. I won't take you back too far, but just to give you an idea of what's going on. You know, we have 7 people come in here every Tuesday and Thursday, usually at a minimum, and we have several other volunteers too that come in. But this is our work area, where we deal with the different archives that are turned into the Historical Society. We have 7 computers networked, and we have a storage area back here, in which we're running out of room to keep all of our archives and records of our archives.
Well, Jim, this has been great learning the things about the railroad and also getting to see half of the Historical Society. I look forward to coming back again and getting to talk to you again and getting some more of the artifacts out on the other side of the museum. And I know I've learned a lot about the railroad and how it began. It's such an important part of our history.
Yeah, I'm sure that when we continue, you're going to see many other different avenues of the types of history we contain here at the Historical Society. This goes back a long way, so we're talking about the establishment of Enola, the township itself, and the operation of the township with a board of directors and commissioners and
Everybody working together on a team.
Yeah, and we never had a mayor of any sort, but we do have a commissioner who's in charge of making sure the operation of East Pennsboro is run properly. So just to give you another little bit of insight here, this building used to belong to West Fairview. It was part of West Fairview's borough operation. But during the modernization of consolidations in townships, West Fairview became too big for their single operation. So what they did was eventually they consolidated West Fairview and Enola to make it one borough of East Pennsboro. East Pennsboro was really always there. They just brought West Fairview Borough in to make it part of, our town. So when they did that back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Herb Kruger, who was our original founder, was involved with talking to the borough here to find out where we could have a location to set up that we could, start to maintain the history and control the history of our township. So they made a deal with Herb, between the commissioners and so forth, and this became available. And when it became available, the borough made some kind of a deal with Herb that we could use this building on a lease, a long-term lease set up. So we have a lease contract with the township. The township owns the building. We maintain it.
Okay.
And we have had upwards of 550 some members. It goes up and down, deaths, new people coming to town and so forth, and people moving in and out of town. So we have anywhere from 450 now up to 525 or so members. It fluctuates from one point of the year to the next. So that's just a lead into the next time we get together.
Absolutely.
We're going to talk some more about local history, the high schools and the different histories that have occurred in the school, like the 1959 football team, which is very notorious from the early years of the high school.
All right.
So thanks for having me.
I'm so looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Jim, for your time today.
No problem.
And I look forward to learning more about the history, as I'm sure most of our members of the library do also.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good day.